lived off the land and worked with cattle. They seldom ever got in a gunfight, and they were working men. Those are the ones I want to talk about. Now you got to remember that there were several eras of cowboys. The earliest cowboys, 1830s, 1840s, they weren't much more than mountain men. They were pretty rough-looking characters. Cattle or horses.
It's inside. Okay.
Now, figured that if they could round up some of these wild cattle that the Mexicans had abandoned after the Mexican War, they could sell them and make a little money. Problem is, the only people that knew how to handle them were the Mexican cowboys. These cattle were wild. So they put the American boys to work next to the Mexicans, and they learned. And they learned how to take care of cattle. And what we commonly think of today as cowboys was a very short period of time. About 1880, 1900. That's not very long. 20 years was about the life of the typical cowboy. Now, you know what it takes to make a cowboy? What does a cowboy have to have in order to do his job? How do you become a cowboy? You know it only takes 3 things to be a cowboy? 3. First is a horse. The reason is that a horse can go anywhere a cow can go. The next is a saddle. And the next, the last and most important, is a rope. You take away any one of those 3 things and he can't do his job. Now, if he's got a rope, he can rope a cow, but if he don't have a saddle to tie the other end of the rope to, what's he going to do with it? That's right. Now, if he don't have a horse that can go where the cow can go, how's he going to catch a cow? So, yeah, those 3 things. Everything else is optional. It just helps him get the job done a little easier, a little better, and maybe a little safer. There were a lot of cowboy accidents and a lot of fatalities. The most common cowboy fatality involved a horse. The horses that they rode were a far different animal than old Concho. This guy's a genuine thoroughbred, a racetrack rescue horse. He was very successful on the track till he had a bad wreck, and that ended it. He's now a really good cow horse. But the cowboy, they rode the rancher's horses. He didn't own the horses. They came off the ranch. They were wild Mustangs that they would round up and break. Now, these old Mustangs, contrary to Hollywood, were not well-groomed, fat, and sassy. They were meaner than $1,400, and they would just as soon eat you alive as let you on their back. And they would simply manhandle the horse until he gave in and they could put him to work. The American cowboy treated his horse like people treat a contractor's pickup today. It was simply a tool to get the job done. Now, Charlie Siringo, in his book, written in 1887, first account of the long cattle drives, goes into how horses were treated on ranches, and it wasn't always nice. The movies have kind of downplayed that some. But you got to remember, look at this in the context of the times. It wasn't today. It was back then when, to get the job done, they sometimes needed to do things that we wouldn't think of doing today. Now, what about a cowboy's optional equipment? All right? Everybody seems to have the idea that a cowboy carried one of these. Single action army. I don't want to disappoint you, but very few of them carried one of these. In fact, Charlie Goodnight would fire a man for swearing, playing cards, or carrying a gun on the job. He said, you're here to work, you're not here to fight. Nothing will start a fight any quicker than those 3 things. It was a business. The cowboy was a low-class migrant worker. He had about maybe 7 months of work a year. He'd hire on in the spring and get laid off in the fall. And the cattle and the horses just fended for themselves all winter, basically. So he did not have a very high standing in the communities because they were pretty undisciplined and pretty uneducated. Now, if they did happen to carry a sidearm, it was not in a buscadero belt and tied down to their leg. Why? Well, if you're 40 miles out here on the side of this hill taking care of cows, what do you need to get your gun out fast for? Good question. If they had a gun, the Colt Single Action Army was about the last one that they would buy. These men were lucky, $25 a month for 7. This gun in 1887 cost $18.50. That's a lot of man only making $25 a month. Now, I have a reproduction of the 1887 Montgomery Ward's catalog. In it, they list the Forehand and Wadsworth double action 38 caliber for $2.50. Now, if you're making minimum wage and you don't really need a firearm, which one would you buy? Me too. Now, another thing that is a very, very popular myth is a cowboy's accuracy with a handgun. Now, I don't know how many of you folks have ever fired a gun, but in my working career before I became a living historian, I was an aerospace engineer with Allied Signal Turbine engines. And I trigged out what the holy grail of rifle shooters is, and that's 1 minute of angle. Not 1 degree, but 1 minute of 1 degree of angle, and that is to keep the impact of the bullet within 1 inch. Yep. Now, on a rifle with 26 inches between the front sight and the back sight, you only need to move either one of them 6/1000ths of an inch to hold 1 minute of angle. Now, on this thing, with about 5 inches, that same 6/1000ths would change that point of impact better than 3 feet. At 20 feet, you'd be lucky to hold it within 4 or 5 feet. So, cartridges for this thing were 70 cents for a box of 50. Now, I have a good friend who was California state champion fast draw artist. Now, he could pull a single action revolver. Now, single action means that the trigger only does one thing. It releases the hammer. When you pull the hammer back, the trigger only releases the hammer. On a double action, every time you pull the trigger, it does 2 things. It cocks the gun and fires it. Well, anyway, Jim Martin, he could pull a single action revolver from the holster and hit 2 targets at 12 feet in 7/10 of a second. Now, he told me that he and his buddy, Bill Waller, who was another fast artist, they would fire 600 to 800 rounds of ammunition a week to stay in that kind of practice. All right, now this cowboy was hired on at $25 a month to go out here in the hills and look after cows. How much practice is he going to do with a handgun, if he even had one? No. They were lousy shots. They were lucky to hit a barn even if they was inside of it. So, what did they do? All right. If they hired on to a ranch and they had a sidearm, the rancher would usually ask to keep it for them until they either went into town or left the ranch.